She performed a medical procedure that doesn't exist. The Pentagon responded within an hour. The fluorescent lights in Bay 4 of Meridian General's emergency department buzzed with that low, relentless hum that never quite lets you forget you're somewhere urgent. It was 11:47 on a Tuesday night, and the ER was running the way it always ran on a Tuesday. Not overwhelmed, not quiet, just that particular kind of tense that makes experienced nurses walk faster and newer ones walk slower, unsure whether the pace is normal or a warning. The overnight attending, Dr. Elliot Granger, was leaning against the nurse's station with his arms folded, reviewing something on a tablet, or at least pretending to. He had that posture that certain men develop when they want everyone around them to feel supervised. And most of the staff had learned over the past 2 years to read that posture correctly. Mara Voss was in Bay 6, quietly restocking the supply drawer with the focused efficiency of someone who treats every task like it matters. She was 41, with dark hair pulled back in a tight bun, the kind of calm face that registers everything without broadcasting anything. She wore the navy blue scrubs that the ER nurses wore, no additional identifying marks, nothing that would make her stand out. If you walked into that department at that hour and scanned the room, you would probably not notice her first. You would notice the attending, or the overhead monitors, or the junior resident who was clearly second-guessing a chart near the door. Mara is the kind of person who disappears into competence. She has practiced it. She has chosen it, deliberately and for reasons that, at this point in the story, nobody in that hospital understands. Pause. She had been at Meridian General for 14 months. She had transferred from a position at a hospital in Bethesda, and before that, according to the file that Dr. Granger had reviewed with some skepticism during her onboarding, she had spent time in what was listed vaguely as federal healthcare services. Nobody had pushed for more specifics. The HR department at Meridian General was not in the habit of digging. Mara Voss had her nursing license. She had her certifications. She had 3 clean reference letters and a manner that in the first week made the charge nurse, a veteran named Patricia Chen, quietly tell a colleague, "That one's going to be fine." Patricia had been right. What Patricia didn't know, what none of them knew, was what fine meant when applied to Mara Voss. But we'll get to that. If you're just finding this channel, welcome. The stories we tell here are fictional, but they're built to feel real because the feelings at the center of them, the frustration of being underestimated, the quiet power of earned competence, the moment when the truth finally surfaces, those feelings are as real as anything. If you want to see more stories like this one, take a moment right now and subscribe to Story Vault. It costs you nothing, and it means the next story finds you instead of you having to go looking. Now let's get back to Bay 6, because something is about to happen in this hospital that nobody is prepared for. Meridian General sat in the outer ring of the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area, about 18 miles from the capital. It was not the flagship hospital in the region. It was not the one the senators went to, or the one that appeared in research publications. It was the one that served 3 zip codes of mixed-income neighborhoods and a cluster of mid-level government contractors and their families. It was a real hospital doing real work, with a staff that ranged from the genuinely excellent to the genuinely burned out, and every grade in between. Dr. Elliot Granger had been its chief of emergency medicine for 6 years. He was 53, had gone to a respectable medical school, and had built his reputation less on any single clinical achievement than on the accumulated weight of his presence, his title, and his ability to make people feel that questioning him was not worth the energy it would cost. Pause. He had a particular way with certain nurses. Not all of them. The ones he favored, the ones who deferred and nodded and said, "Of course, doctor." Those nurses found his rotation manageable. The ones who pushed back, politely, professionally, on clinical grounds, those nurses found their schedules shifted to the less desirable slots, their incident reports lingering in administrative review longer than they should, their requests for continuing education funding denied without explanation. It was the kind of workplace dynamic that doesn't leave fingerprints, the kind that human resources calls interpersonal friction and ultimately documents as a personality conflict. Nobody files a formal complaint because the calculus never quite works in their favor. Mara Voss had been in that second category since approximately her 3rd week at Meridian General. The incident that marked her was small. Granger had been managing a chest pain patient and had made a medication call that Mara believed was dosing outside the recommended range for a patient with the renal function numbers she had reviewed. She had said so, quietly, precisely, citing the specific value. Granger had looked at her for a long moment the way a man looks at something he finds mildly inconvenient, and then he had said, "Thank you, Nurse Voss," in a tone that meant the opposite and had proceeded exactly as he intended. The medication adjustment was later flagged in the patient's chart by the overnight hospitalist. Nothing bad had happened. Nothing was ever said directly. But Mara Voss had been on Granger's radar from that point forward, and not in a way that helped her. There had been a meeting in December, then another in February, both framed as performance development conversations, which is the HR language for something that doesn't rise to a formal action but is intended to establish a paper trail. The charges in both cases were soft. Communication style, tendency to challenge physician authority without clear clinical basis, difficulty integrating with team norms. Mara had attended both meetings, answered every question with calm precision, signed the acknowledgement forms without dispute, and returned to work. She had not complained to Patricia Chen, though Patricia had noticed. She had not filed a counter-response with HR, though she was certainly within her rights to do so. She had gone back to Bay 6 and restocked the supply drawer. Pause. There were 3 people in that hospital who had noticed something unusual about Mara Voss, and none of them had been able to fully articulate what it was. The first was Patricia Chen, who had 22 years of emergency nursing behind her and trusted her instincts the way musicians trust their ear. Patricia noticed that Mara never flinched. In the ER, almost everyone flinches at something. The truly gruesome injuries, the coding infants, the screaming psychiatric patients in restraints. Not a visible flinch, not always, but something. A tightening, a half-second where the face closes. Mara did not do this. She moved into the most difficult situations with a quality that Patricia could only describe as orientation, like a compass finding north. It was almost unsettling. The second person was a third-year resident named Dr. James Okoye, who had worked a handful of overlapping shifts with Mara and had found himself, on 3 separate occasions, following her instinct over the attending's instruction, quietly, deniably, and being right every time. He had never said anything to her about it, but he remembered. The third person was the hospital's head of security, a retired Army staff sergeant named Marcus Webb, who had served 2 tours before a knee injury transitioned him to civilian work. He and Mara had never spoken about it. They had never needed to. But in the small, unmistakable shorthand of people who have been in certain places and done certain things, they recognized something in each other across the lobby every morning. He always nodded slightly more than he nodded at anyone else. She always nodded back. These 3 people would all matter before this night was over. If you're feeling that slow build of tension, the sense that this story is coiling up toward something, you're reading it right. This is exactly the kind of story we live for at Story Vault. If someone shared this with you and you haven't subscribed yet, now is a perfect moment. Hit that subscribe button and leave a comment below telling me. Have you ever watched someone get consistently underestimated and then watch the moment it finally caught up with the people doing the underestimating? I want to hear from you. Let's keep going. Pause. The call came in at 12:19 a.m. Dispatch relayed a mass casualty event on the interstate, a 3-vehicle collision involving a commercial transport and 2 passenger vehicles. Meridian General was not the primary trauma center for the region, but the primary center, Riverside Trauma, had radioed in a capacity diversion. Meridian was getting overflow. The triage board showed 4 incoming patients, severity ranked 2 critical, 1 serious, 1 stable. The department activated its internal surge protocol, which at that hour of the night meant pulling an additional nurse from the medical floor upstairs and waking the on-call trauma attending, Dr. Sandra Park, who would be there in 11 minutes by car. The first 2 patients arrived simultaneously, a 28-year-old male from one of the passenger vehicles who had a visible fracture of the left femur and significant road trauma but was conscious and stable enough to be screaming about it, and a 59-year-old woman from the same vehicle who was unconscious and dropping pressure fast. Granger took the femur fracture. He assigned Mara and a junior nurse named Taylor to the unconscious woman. Mara read this as intentional. The unconscious woman was the harder case, the one with more variables, and assigning it to a nurse instead of taking it himself, or assigning the senior resident, was a move that carried a message. Mara didn't acknowledge the message, she just moved. Pause. The woman's name, they would learn later, was Margaret Osa, a 59-year-old retired schoolteacher from Silver Spring who had been driving home from her daughter's birthday dinner when the transport vehicle crossed the median. Right now, she was a body with plummeting vitals and a trauma profile that was evolving fast. Mara called out her assessment in short, clear bursts as she worked. BP 68/40 and falling, breath sounds diminished on the right, trachea beginning to deviate, external injury pattern consistent with high-velocity chest compression. No immediate evidence of external hemorrhage. Taylor was moving in lockstep beside her, anticipating supplies before Mara had finished naming them. In 3 minutes, Mara had built a picture of what was happening inside Margaret Osai's chest, and it was a picture that called for an immediate intervention. She stepped to the bay door and said, evenly and without particular inflection, "Dr. Granger, I need a physician in Bay 3 for tension pneumothorax decompression now." Granger was across the room. He looked up from the femur fracture which his resident was stabilizing competently, and he looked at Mara for a moment in the way that people look at sounds that interrupt them. "Dr. Park is 2 minutes out," he said. "Hold your position." Mara looked at the monitor. BP was now 61/35. The tracheal deviation was progressing. "She doesn't have 2 minutes," Mara said. Pause. The room felt it. That's the only way to describe it. A kind of current that moved through the space between those two sentences. Dr. James Okoye, who was charting near the wall, stopped charting. Taylor's hands paused on the supply cart for just a fraction of a second. Even the femur patient, who had been audibly managing his pain, went quiet. Granger walked over. He looked at the monitor. He looked at the patient. He did the fast clinical scan that any attending would do in that situation, and then he said, "She's borderline. Give her another minute and let's see if." "She will arrest in under 90 seconds, Mara said. The tone was not confrontational. It was specific. It was the tone of someone reading information off a screen that is not subject to debate. Granger's jaw tightened. "Nurse Voss, I gave you an instruction. And I'm telling you the patient can't survive it. I'm requesting emergency authority to decompress." There was a beat of silence. The monitor alarmed, BP 54/29. Granger's face moved through something, irritation, calculation, and then a particular kind of defensiveness that takes over in people who are afraid of being wrong in front of an audience. "Stand down," he said. "I'll manage this patient." He turned back to the supply cart to retrieve what he needed for a needle thoracostomy, the standard decompression procedure. And that was when the second ambulance bay doors opened, and a new patient arrived on a stretcher, not from the highway collision, but from a different emergency entirely. It was one of the critical list patients from the original dispatch, a male in his 60s, in dark civilian clothing, with a federal ID lanyard visible at his collar, surrounded by 3 men in suits who had arrived with the ambulance in a black vehicle that nobody had called, and who were speaking rapidly into earpieces. Everything in the department shifted. Pause. If you're watching this and you just realized we now have 2 simultaneous crises in this emergency room, you're right, and it's about to matter more than you can imagine. Every detail laid out in the last 10 minutes is about to fold back on itself. This is exactly the kind of story that keeps you watching till the end. And if you've been meaning to like this video, this is a good moment to do it. It helps this story reach people who haven't found it yet. Now, let's stay in that ER. The man on the second stretcher was 64 years old, silver-haired, broad-shouldered in the way of someone who had been physically disciplined for decades even if time had softened the edges. The paramedic's verbal handoff was fast. Motorcade accident on the Beltway, secondary to the original multi-vehicle event. Blunt chest trauma, possible rib fractures, BP erratic, O2 sat dropping despite high-flow oxygen, GCS 12 and falling. The federal ID lanyard bore the seal of the Department of Defense. Granger crossed the room. The suited men moved with him in a formation that was not aggressive but was completely unambiguous. One of them spoke to Granger in a low, controlled voice. Granger's expression changed, not dramatically, but it changed. "In Bay 3. Margaret Osai's monitor screamed. Pause. Mara heard it. She was already there. She did not look across the room to see what Granger was doing. She did not call out again. She assessed the bay, her patient, her supplies, her situation, and she made a decision that was the product of 14 months of civilian nursing and 18 years of something else entirely. She reached for the decompression kit. Taylor was beside her. "You got authority?" Taylor whispered. "I've got a dying patient," Mara said quietly. She performed the needle thoracostomy with a precision that made Taylor hold her breath. Clean entry at the second intercostal space, midclavicular line, the hiss of released pressure immediate and unmistakable, the monitor's alarm tapering as BP began to claw back up. Textbook. Fast. Correct in every dimension. Margaret Osai's color began to return within 30 seconds. But Mara was not done. Pause. Here is where the story changes. Here is the thing that would later put Mara Voss at the center of a meeting at the Pentagon. As she stabilized Bay 3, Mara's attention was drawn, not by choice, but by the way that elite clinical training draws attention toward complexity like a compass toward magnetic north, to the second patient. The duty official, the man whose status had just reorganized the entire department. Dr. Park had arrived now, breathless from the elevator, and was moving toward the duty patient. Granger was hovering. The suited men were conferring. It was controlled chaos, the kind that looks organized from a distance and is actually very precarious. Mara completed her charting on Margaret Os, confirmed a stable handoff was in motion, and walked to the supply room adjacent to Bay 5, where the duty patient was now being assessed. She was supposed to be going for a medication bag. She was technically in a legitimate location, but she stopped just outside the bay's partition because the pattern on the monitor, the specific waveform she could see from where she stood, was telling her something that she suspected nobody else in that room was equipped to hear. It was not a standard tension pneumothorax. It was not a hemothorax. The waveform, combined with the saturation pattern, the blood pressure curve, and the physical profile of the patient, was consistent with something that did not appear in any civilian medical textbook. It appeared in a protocol document that had been classified at the secret level since its development in 2009. A document that Mara Voss had not read. She had written it. Pause. She stepped into the bay. "Dr. Park," she said, "a word." Dr. Park looked up, surprised. She was a good physician, thorough, careful, appropriately humble about the limits of her knowledge. She had 2 months of working alongside Myra and trusted her professionally, even if she didn't know quite why. "Nurse Voss, I've got this one," she said, not unkindly. "His waveform has a biphasic notch at the T-wave with a non-standard pressure differential," Mara said, quietly enough that only Park could hear. "It's not presenting as a standard tension event. If you decompress classically, you will stabilize the surface problem and miss the underlying vascular shunt that is actually killing him. He has maybe 6 minutes before that shunt closes the circuit." Park stared at her. "A vascular shunt, that's not, where is that in the literature?" "It's not," Mara said, "not in civilian literature." The room was loud. Nobody else had heard this exchange. Outside the partition, Granger was speaking to the suited men, performing the kind of confident authority that he was very good at performing. "What are you suggesting?" Park said. Myra looked at the patient. Then she looked back at Park, and she said the most important sentence she had spoken in 14 months of employment at Meridian General Hospital. "I'm suggesting that you let me do what I know how to do, and that you document that I said what I just said before you decide." Pause. This is the moment. You can feel it, can't you? That still air before the thunder quality. If you've ever been in a situation where someone said the quiet, true thing that the room needed to hear and the room just stopped, you know exactly what this feels like. I want to hear about your version of this moment. Drop it in the comments. Seriously. And while you're down there, subscribe to Story Vault if you haven't. We're going deep tonight and you don't want to lose this story in your feed. Dr. Park made a decision in approximately 4 seconds. It was a decision that required her to trust something she could not fully explain, about a person whose full credentials she did not know, in a situation where if she was wrong, the consequences would be enormous. She stepped back and said, quietly, "Talk me through it as you go." Myra nodded once. She moved to the patient. What she did next took 11 minutes. In that 11 minutes, she performed a procedure that combined elements of a guided vascular pressure release with a secondary chamber access technique that she had developed over 3 years of forward combat surgical work, specifically for a class of blunt force chest trauma that occurred disproportionately in high-speed vehicle impacts involving armored vehicles. The procedure had a name in the classified protocol document. It was not a name that appeared anywhere in civilian medical literature. The equipment she needed was not a standard ER kit item, but it was improvised from components that were present in every well-stocked emergency department if you knew exactly which 3 things to combine. She used her hands, 2 modified instruments, and a focused acoustic assessment technique to guide the intervention without imaging. She was quiet throughout. Her instructions to Taylor were precise and minimal. Dr. Park watched with an expression that moved from skepticism to concentration to something that looked very much like reverence. Pause. At minute 7, the monitor showed a pressure stabilization pattern that Park had never seen before. A smooth, rapid normalization without the usual compensatory spike. The duty official's saturation climbed from 83 to 96 in 2 minutes. His GCS improved within 4. By minute 11, his vitals were not just stable. They were trending in a direction that Park, in her honest clinical assessment, would later describe in writing as inexplicably favorable given the injury severity. Myra stepped back. She stripped her gloves. She did not look at the monitor with triumph. She looked at it the way you look at a problem that has been correctly solved. Once confirming, and then you move on. He'll need a cardiac CT and a thoracic surgical consult, she said to Park. But the immediate threat is resolved. The shunt will close cleanly on its own now. Then she went back to Bay 3 to complete her documentation on Margaret Ose. Pause. The room had changed. That's the only phrase for it. It had changed the way light changes when a cloud passes, subtly but completely, and you realize that you've been seeing everything in the wrong register for the past hour. Taylor was standing near the supply cart with an expression that she would later describe to her roommate as like watching someone fold origami with their eyes closed. Dr. Park was standing very still, looking at the monitor, and then at the doorway Myra had walked out of, and then at the monitor again. Dr. James Akoy, who had watched the last 6 minutes of the procedure from the hallway, turned and walked quietly back to the physician workroom and did not immediately return. Dr. Granger had been on the far side of the department, managing the logistics of the DUD patient's admission when the most critical phase of Myra's intervention had taken place. He had not seen the procedure. When he returned to Bay 5 and found the patient stable, he asked Park what had happened. Park told him. Granger's face did something complicated, and then it settled into a version of itself that those who knew him would recognize as dangerous. This is where the story gets ugly before it gets right. Pause. There is a kind of anger that isn't really anger. It's fear with a title. It's the feeling that a person at the center of a system gets when the system reveals that it was never really about them. Granger had built his position at Meridian General over 6 years. He had built it on the assumption that he was, in every room he walked into, the most clinically capable person present. He had made decisions about staffing, about credit, about who got promoted and who got managed out, based on that assumption. And in the last 40 minutes, a nurse he had been engineering out of his department had very quietly proved that assumption catastrophically wrong in front of witnesses, on the most high-profile patient the department had ever received. He called Myra into his office at 2:15 a.m. She came without protest, still in her scrubs, carrying nothing but her badge and her comm. He was direct. He had to be, because the nature of what he was doing required a speed that was inversely proportional to how he usually operated. You performed an unauthorized intervention on a critical patient without attending authorization, he said. I performed a life-saving intervention in the absence of attending availability, consistent with emergency nursing scope of practice under the facility's autonomy clause, Myra said. I documented every step before acting. Dr. Park was present and observing throughout. Dr. Park is a resident. Dr. Park is a licensed physician. You are a nurse, Myra. She held his gaze. There was a beat of silence that was not combative and was not defeated. It was simply clear. Is there something you need from me right now, Dr. Granger, or are we done? He placed a written notice on the desk in front of her. Administrative suspension pending review of unaut. Horized intervention, effective immediately. She was to leave the premises and await contact from HR. Her badge was to be surrendered at security. He said this all in a measured, procedural tone that was designed to communicate. This is not personal, this is policy. And it was designed to communicate something else underneath that, which was, you stepped over a line I drew, and now I am going to use every tool available to make sure it costs you. Pause. She picked up the notice. She read it completely, not skimming, actually reading. She set it back on the desk. I'd like a copy, she said. He slid a second page to her. She took it. She thanked him by name. She walked to the door and then she stopped and said, without turning around, the patient in Bay 5, make sure the thoracic surgical consult request I submitted is still in his chart. It matters for his 48-hour outcome. And then she left. Patricia Chen was at the nurse's station when Mara came through the department on her way to surrender her badge. Mara handed Patricia the patient documentation she had been completing, pointed to 2 items that needed follow-up in the morning, and said simply, "I've been suspended pending review. I'll be in touch." Patricia's face moved through about 6 emotions in 3 seconds. She opened her mouth. Mara held up one hand slightly, not dismissive, just quiet, and walked on. At the security desk, Marcus Webb accepted her badge. He held it for a moment. He looked at her. He said nothing. She said nothing. They nodded at each other in that particular way, and she walked through the sliding doors into the cold early morning, and the hospital swallowed the silence she left behind. Pause. I want to pause here and just acknowledge something, because if you're feeling a specific kind of frustration right now, a heat in your chest, you are supposed to feel that. This story is designed to make you feel the weight of what just happened. A person saved a life, 2 lives, technically, and walked out of the building suspended. That's the injustice the whole narrative is built on, and it's supposed to land hard. Take a breath, because we're about to watch the world correct itself. If you want to make sure you're here for that moment, subscribe to Story Vault right now and keep watching. We're past the halfway point, and the part that's coming next is why we tell stories like this one. The duty official's name was Raymond Holt. General Raymond Holt, though he had technically transitioned to a civilian appointment 14 months earlier as Deputy Secretary of Defense. He was a man of considerable weight in multiple senses. He had spent 31 years in the Army, including a decade commanding special operations logistics and medical support in theaters that required a level of precision and discretion that most people never knew existed. He was known, in the small community of people who knew him, as a man who paid attention to things that other people missed, and who had a particular impatience with institutions that confused protocol with wisdom. He woke up in the ICU at 8:03 a.m. He was not confused. He was, by the account of the overnight nurse who had been monitoring him, unusually alert for a man who had presented the night before with the vitals profile he had presented with. His first coherent question, asked within 40 seconds of opening his eyes, was, "Who did the procedure?" The night nurse, not familiar with the procedural details, said she would find out. Pause. His security detail, who had maintained a rotating presence outside his room through the night, had a more complete picture. One of the suited men, a deputy named Aaron Farrell, had been present in Bay 5 during the intervention. He had watched Mara work. He had not known what he was watching in the moment, but he had spent the overnight hours making calls, and by 6 a.m. he had a much clearer understanding. By 8 a.m., he had a name, a personnel file, and a situation that he recognized, immediately and without ambiguity, as something that required a very specific kind of attention. At 8:47 a.m., a black SUV with federal plates was parked in the lot of a small coffee shop 2 miles from Meridian General. Inside, Mara Voss was sitting in a corner booth with a cup of coffee and a paperback book, waiting with the equanimity of someone who has learned not to spend energy on things she cannot immediately control. Her phone had received 3 calls from numbers she did not recognize. Beginning at 7 a.m., she had not answered them. At 8:51, Aaron Farrell walked into the coffee shop, identified her without difficulty, and sat down across from her. He placed a federal identification document on the table. He said, "Ms. Voss, General Holt would like to speak with you." She looked at the identification. She looked at Farrell. "How is he?" she said. "Stable," Farrell said. "Good vitals, he's asking for you specifically." "I've been suspended from the hospital." "You won't need to go through the hospital," Farrell said. Pause. The drive back to Meridian General was not the way Mara would have expected, if she had been thinking in terms of expectation. The black SUV pulled into the hospital's restricted access bay, the one used for ambulances and official deliveries, and she was escorted not through the main emergency department, but directly to the ICU via the service corridor that hospital staff used to avoid the public areas. The escort was professional, quiet, and suggested a familiarity with the hospital's physical layout that implied someone had been paying close attention since the early morning hours. General Holt was sitting up in the bed when she entered. He looked, for a man who had been in critical condition less than 9 hours earlier, genuinely and almost startlingly well. He looked at her when she walked in, and for a moment neither of them said anything, and the room held a quality of recognition that was not available to anyone else in the building. "Lieutenant Colonel Voss," he said. She stopped moving. The title hadn't been attached to her name in 14 months. She stood very still for a moment, and then she said, "General." He nodded slowly. "Sit down," he said. "We need to talk." Pause. This is the room change moment. This is the scene that reframes everything. And if you've been along for this whole story so far, you've been building toward exactly this. Before we go in, if you have a friend who loves stories like this, stories about quiet dignity and earned truth, share this video with them right now. Not because of any numbers, but because some stories are worth sharing with people you care about. Now, let's step into that ICU room. General Raymond Holt had known the name Mara Voss for 13 years. He had first encountered it in 2013, on a medical after-action report from a forward operating base in eastern Afghanistan, where an Army Medical Corps officer attached to a Special Operations Support Element had stabilized 3 critically injured soldiers under circumstances that the report described as clinically extraordinary given available resources and operational conditions. He had flagged the report. He had tracked the officer's career with the particular interest he reserved for people who demonstrated a specific category of talent, the kind that appears effortless precisely because it is so deeply developed. He had been the approving authority in 2015 for the classified medical protocol that Mara Voss had drafted. The protocol that addressed a specific class of high-velocity blunt chest trauma injury profile, the one with the biphasic waveform signature, the one with the vascular shunt complication, that had been documented repeatedly in armored vehicle accidents in contested environments, and that had been killing people for years because nobody had put the clinical picture together until Voss did. He had read her protocol documentation personally. He had submitted it for internal DoD classification and distribution. He had considered it, and still considered it, one of the most important pieces of applied military medicine produced in the 2010s. What he had not known, until Farrell's early morning calls began connecting the dots, was that Lieutenant Colonel Mara Voss, who had medically separated from the Army in 2024 after a non-combat injury that affected her surgical hand strength, had been working, under a civilian nursing credential, in a mid-tier emergency department 18 miles from his office. Pause. "Why?" he asked her directly after she had sat down. "Why a nursing role? You hold an MD, your boards are current, you could be attending anywhere." She looked at her hands for a moment. The right one, if you knew what to look for, held a very slight but permanent tremor in the 4th and 5th fingers, the souvenir of a vehicle accident during her final deployment that had damaged the fine motor control she would have needed for complex open surgical work. She could do everything she had done last night. She could not do a 14-hour open heart procedure. "I can still do the work that matters," she said. "I just can't do the work that gets the title." He was quiet for a moment. "And the hospital, did they know?" "I listed my credentials accurately," she said. "My nursing license is real. My federal history was disclosed in a general sense. Nobody asked specifically." "Nobody asked," he repeated, in a tone that conveyed clearly how he felt about that. "People see what they expect to see, General," she said. "In my experience, that doesn't change much regardless of what you tell them." Pause. He told her then what Farrell had pieced together from his own diagnostics, which the ICU's attending physician had confirmed that morning. That the intervention Mara had performed had addressed a complication that, without treatment, would have produced a secondary cardiac event within 8 to 12 hours of admissi. One that would have been attributed to the original trauma injury and would not have been connected to a missed vascular finding. That he was alive in a clinically meaningful sense, not because of the emergency response on the Beltway, not because of the standard care at Meridian General, but because a woman in Navy scrubs had recognized a classified injury pattern at midnight and done something about it. He said this without drama. Holt was not a man who performed gratitude. He stated it the way he stated intelligence assessments, clearly, completely, without editorialization. "I was suspended this morning," Myra said, "for performing an unauthorized intervention." Holt looked at Farrell, who was standing near the door. Something passed between them, a very brief, very controlled version of a look that said, "Yes, I know, and yes, that is what we are here to address." "Tell me about the attending," Holt said. She told him not everything, not the December meeting, not the February meeting, not the accumulated weight of 14 months of small, undocumentable hostility. She told him the clinical facts of the night before in sequence with the kind of precision she applied to everything. Granger's instruction to hold position, the patient's deteriorating vitals, her request for attending intervention, his refusal, her decision, the suspension. She told it flat and factual, the way a report is written, without affect, and Holt listened the same way. When she finished, he was quiet for a full 10 seconds. Then he said, "Who's the chief administrator?" "Director Karen Whitfield," Mara said. He nodded once. "Give us a few minutes," he told Farrell. Pause. What happened in the next 45 minutes, Mara would later describe as the most surreal professional experience of her life, which was a significant statement from someone whose professional life had included operating on trauma patients in a sandstorm. Holt made 3 phone calls from his ICU bed. She did not know who he called. She was not in the room for 2 of them. But the effect of those calls became visible approximately 12 minutes after the third one ended, in the form of Director Karen Whitfield, who arrived on the ICU floor looking like someone who had been told to arrive quickly but had not been told why, and whose composure fractured slightly when she walked into the room and understood immediately, from the federal security presence and the identity of the patient, that the situation she was walking into was operating on a level significantly above her normal administrative experience. Holt did not perform the conversation. He did not grandstand. He introduced himself, his full name, his title, his relevant connection to the patient file, and then he described with the same flat precision that Mara used what had happened the night before. He was specific about the medical facts. He was specific about the intervention. He was specific about the suspension. And then he said, "I'd like to understand your hospital's administrative process here, Director, because I want to make sure I'm reading it correctly before I make further contact." "Further contact," Whitfield repeated. "I have calls into 2 offices," he said. "I'm waiting to hear back." He didn't say which offices. He didn't need to. Pause. We need to pause here and appreciate something. There was no yelling in that room. Nobody threw a folder across a table. Nobody was called names or threatened overtly. This was not a movie version of justice. It was something closer to real justice, which moves through institutions the way water moves through rock, quietly, methodically, and with absolute inevitability. That's the kind of story that stays with you. If this is your first time on Story Vault, this is what we do here. Subscribe so you're here for the next one. Let's keep going because we are not finished yet. Director Whitfield called Granger. He arrived at the ICU floor conference room 19 minutes later. He was well dressed for 10 a.m., which was a detail that, if you were paying attention, told you something about the kind of person he was. He had known, when he got the call, that something official was happening, and he had taken the time to prepare himself visually for it. He walked in with the particular posture of someone who has decided to lead with authority and assess the situation from that position. He saw Whitfield. He saw Mara. He saw Farrell. And then he saw General Holt in the chair at the head of the table, no longer in a hospital bed, having insisted on being moved for the meeting, dressed in a facility gown and civilian jacket that his detail had retrieved, and something in Granger's posture recalibrated. Holt was not in uniform. He didn't need to be. The room already understood what he was. "Dr. Granger," Holt said, "thank you for coming. Sit down." Pause. What followed was procedural. It was precisely, intentionally procedural, and that is exactly W. Hat made it devastating. Holt walked through the timeline of the prior night in the same sequence every time. The original dispatch, Granger's assignment of the critical patient to a nursing team without attending coverage, the specific vital trajectory of the patient in Bay 3, Mara's documented request for physician intervention, Granger's documented refusal and instruction to hold position, the continued deterioration, Mara's autonomous decompression decision, and the outcome. He had the chart documentation in front of him. Farrell had obtained it through legitimate channels. By 9 a.m., he walked through it the way a senior officer walks through an after-action review, methodically, without hostility, naming each decision point and its consequence. Granger began to respond at the third point. He said that the autonomy clause invocation was questionable, that the patient's vitals at the time of his assessment did not clearly indicate imminent arrest, that Mara's intervention, however ultimately successful, had been outside scope. He said it professionally. He was clearly a man who knew how to perform in an accountability conversation. Holt let him finish. Then he said, "The patient in Bay 3 is currently in the recovery unit, awake and speaking. Her cardiologist reviewed the intervention documentation this morning and found it to be not only appropriate but the fastest correct decompression he has seen documented at this facility. That's in writing. He slid a copy across the table. The patient in Bay 5, he paused. That patient is me, Dr. Granger, and the intervention performed on me was not unauthorized. It was authorized by the attending who was present and observing. Dr. Park will confirm that. He slid a second document, Park's written account, prepared that morning. It was also the intervention that is described in a 2D medical protocol that has been in classified distribution since 2016, a protocol that the nurse who performed it wrote before she transitioned to civilian health care. Pause. Granger was very still. The procedure you described as unauthorized is documented in federal military medical literature as the standard of care for the specific injury profile presented, Holt continued. The reason you weren't familiar with it is because it's classified, and the reason it's classified is because it was developed specifically for combat trauma environments. Nurse Voss, Dr. Voss, brought that knowledge into your emergency department 14 months ago, and from what I've read this morning, has been providing clinical contributions above and beyond her stated role for the duration of her employment, while receiving administrative pressure rather than recognition. He set down the documents. I'm not here to conduct a disciplinary action personally. That's not my role. But I am here as both a patient who received direct benefit from her expertise and as an official with an interest in ensuring that documented competence is not systemically suppressed in a facility that receives federal funding and serves federal employees. Director Whitfield, I'd like to understand your next steps. Whitfield, who had not spoken for 20 minutes, said, The suspension will be lifted immediately. I'll conduct a full review of the administrative actions taken against Dr. Voss over the past 14 months. Holt nodded. He looked at Granger. Dr. Granger, is there anything you'd like to add? Granger said nothing. There was nothing to add. The room had already said everything that needed to be said. Pause. There is a specific kind of silence that falls when someone who has been wielding quiet institutional power against another person sits in a room and watches the full shape of what they've done become visible to everyone around them. It is not the silence of victory or the silence of cruelty. It is the silence of accounting, of a ledger being corrected, of a weight that has been pressing on someone for a long time being simply, formally removed. Granger sat in that silence. And Mara Voss, who had not said a word in the last 30 minutes, who had sat in that room and let the documentation speak, which is exactly what she would have done, because she had been trained to let truth do the heavy lifting, looked at no particular point on the wall and breathed quietly and waited for it to be finished. It was finished in another 11 minutes. The formal procedural pieces were documented, signatures obtained, next steps outlined. Whitfield would convene an administrative panel. The panel would review the December and February performance development meetings in light of the new documentation. Dr. Granger was placed on administrative review pending the outcome of that panel, effective end of business that day. Mara's suspension was formally revoked. Her badge would be reissued at the security desk. When the room cleared, General Holt asked Farrell to give him and Mara 5 minutes alone. Farrell nodded. Dead and closed the door. Pause. Before we go into that room, before we hear what General Holt said to Mara Voss in those 5 quiet minutes, I want to say something to the people who are still here 45+ minutes into this story. You stayed. You watched a woman be underestimated and dismissed and quietly punished for being excellent, and you stayed. I think you stayed because some part of this story lives in your real life somewhere. Maybe you've been Mara. Maybe you've worked beside someone like her. Maybe you've watched someone like Granger and felt that specific helpless frustration of knowing something is wrong and not having the mechanism to fix it. If any of that is true for you, leave a comment. Tell me. These stories mean the most when they connect to something real in your life. And subscribe to Story Vault, because if you're still here, you belong here. Holt leaned back in his chair and looked at Mara for a moment with the expression of someone who is deciding how honest to be. Then he decided to be completely honest, because that was, apparently, what he did. I should have kept better track of you after your separation, he said. That's a failure on my part. The people who did what you did for the service, we owe them a better transition than you got. Mara was quiet for a moment. I got what I needed, she said. The work is the same either way. The title doesn't change what you can see. No, he agreed, but the title protects you, and you've been working without protection for 14 months. She acknowledged that with a slight nod. "I'm aware." "What do you actually want?" he asked. "Not what you think is possible. What do you want?" She looked at him. It was a question she had not been asked directly and seriously in a long time. She was quiet for about 8 seconds. Then she said, "I want to work. I want to work in a place where the work is the only thing that matters. I want to do what I did last night, and I want to not have to fight for the right to do it." Holt nodded slowly. He said, "I think we can arrange that." Pause. In the days that followed, the administrative panel convened as promised. It reviewed 14 months of documentation with the particular rigor that tends to emerge when people at the top of an institution suddenly understand that scrutiny from outside is possible. What the panel found was not a single smoking gun, but a pattern, small, consistent, and cumulative, of decisions that had disadvantaged Mara Voss professionally without documented clinical justification. The December meeting. The February meeting. Schedule assignments. Training request denials. An incident report from April that had been filed against her for a medication query, the kind Mara had raised on her third week, that the panel found to be in the exact language of their report, without clinical basis and inconsistent with the documentation record. Dr. Granger was placed on indefinite administrative leave pending a formal review by the State Medical Board, which Whitfield had, after consultation with legal counsel, elected to refer the matter to. The referral was a procedural one, a disclosure of a pattern of workplace decisions that potentially intersected with patient safety concerns. But in the world of medical licensure, that kind of referral lands with the weight of stone. Pause. Patricia Chen found out the full story on the third day when James Akoy, who had spent 48 hours in something approaching moral turmoil, told her everything he had witnessed, including the 3 occasions he had followed Mara's clinical judgment over the attendings and been right. Patricia listened without interrupting, which was unusual for her, and when he finished she sat quietly for a moment and then said, "I knew it," not as a boast, as a release. As someone who had trusted a feeling for 14 months and was finally being told the feeling was right. Marcus Webb at the security desk heard about the badge reissuance from the administrative coordinator who came down to process it. He asked a few quiet questions. He learned what he needed to know. When Mara came to pick up the badge, he handed it to her and said very quietly, "Welcome back, Lieutenant Colonel." She looked at him. He was looking straight ahead as if he hadn't said anything. She took the badge. She put it on. She said at the same volume, "Thank you, Staff Sergeant." And they both went back to their respective work. That was all, and it was exactly right. Pause. Margaret Osa was discharged on day 4. She had been told in general terms that the nurse who had initially stabilized her had made a critical intervention. She had asked to say thank you. The floor coordinator had made a note of it. On the day of her discharge, Mara happened to be starting a shift, and Patricia made sure their paths crossed briefly in the corridor. Mara stood and listened while Margaret, a small woman in a green discharge day suite, told her that she was grateful, that she had 2 grandchildren whose names she gave, that she had been planning to visit her daughter the following weekend and now would. Mara said, "I'm glad you're going." And she meant it in the full, clean, uncomplicated way that people who have been doing this work for a long time can mean simple things. Pause. 6 weeks later, Mara received an offer letter. It came through a federal healthcare integration office that she had not previously been aware of, a small but specifically funded program connecting classified medical expertise with civilian trauma networks in high-risk metropolitan areas. The program had been created, formally and on paper, 2.5 years earlier. In practical terms, its first real position had been activated in the past 6 weeks. The role was a senior clinical leadership position with attending equivalent authority, a compensation level appropriate to her credentials, and a charter that explicitly included protocol development and cross-sector trauma training. The letter was signed by 2 people, the program director and General Raymond Holt in his official capacity. She read it once at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee. She set it down. She looked out the window at the gray February morning. She thought about the night in Bay 6 when she had been restocking the supply drawer at 11:47 and how the fluorescent light had buzzed and how nothing about that moment had looked like it was leading anywhere in particular. And she thought about the fact that the work was the same then as it would be now. The title had changed. The work hadn't. And the work was the thing. She signed the letter. Pause. There is a specific kind of dignity that belongs to people who do the right thing when no one is watching, in rooms that no one will document, for patients who will never know their full story. It's not the dignity of recognition, though recognition, when it comes, is right and good and worth defending. It's the dignity that exists before and after recognition, independent of it. Mara Voss had that dignity in Bay 6 at 11:47 at night, restocking supplies under fluorescent lights, in the middle of a career that most of her former colleagues would never have understood. She had it when she told Granger that she needed a physician in Bay 3. She had it when she signed the administrative suspension notice without raising her voice. She had it when she nodded to Marcus Webb and walked through the sliding doors into the cold morning. The title at the end was just the world finally catching up with what the work had always known. Pause. And here is the thing this story is really about, underneath all the procedure and the documentation and the satisfying institutional reckoning. It is about the assumption of incompetence, the quiet, persistent, cultural habit of looking at a person and deciding what they are capable of based on the slot they currently occupy, the badge they currently wear, the deference they currently project. Granger never asked Mara Voss why she thought what she thought. He never asked what she had seen that he hadn't. He heard nurse and stopped listening. And that choice, a small daily choice that he had been making for 6 years without consequence, almost cost a room full of people everything. We make those choices too. The story asks us to notice that. Pause. Before we close tonight, there are 2 things I want to leave with you. The first is about the patients. In this story, they are the still center around which all the human noise rotates. Margaret Osai, who wanted to visit her daughter. General Holt, who woke up in the ICU and asked immediately who had done the work. The femur fracture patient across the room whose name we never learned. Every person who walks into an emergency room has a full life that the institution never completely sees. The nurses and doctors who understand that, who treat the person and not just the vitals, they are the ones who make the difference that matters. The ones like Mara. The ones we should be working to protect and recognize and, frankly, pay attention to. The second thing I want to leave with you is this: competence doesn't make noise. It doesn't perform. It just does the work with whatever tools are available in whatever room it's been assigned to, under whatever fluorescent light is buzzing overhead. And the remarkable thing is that it tends to hold. Through every attempt to suppress it, dismiss it, manage it out, write it up, or suspend it, real competence tends to hold. It held in Bay 3. It held in Bay 5. It held in the conference room on the ICU floor where nobody yelled and the documents did the work they were supposed to do. It held, quietly and without drama, for 14 months in a hospital where it was never quite understood. And that matters, because it always does. Pause. If this story moved you, and I mean that genuinely, I mean if something in the last hour touched something real for you, I would love to hear about it in the comments. Not a quick reaction, an actual thought, about Myra or about someone like her you've known, about the Grangers you've worked under, about the Margaret Osais you've sat with, about the moment in your own life when the documentation finally said what the room had been avoiding. I read the comments. Not everyone, but I try. And those conversations are part of why we make these stories. Subscribe to Story Vault if you're not subscribed. It means future stories come to you, and every new story is another room where the fluorescent lights are buzzing and someone is doing the work quietly in the corner, waiting to be seen. You won't want to miss it. And share this one if you know someone who needs it today. Not because the numbers matter, because some stories are meant to travel. This has been Story Vault. Mara Voss walked back through the sliding doors. The light was the same, the work was the same, and she was exactly who she had always been, which was, in the end, more than enough. Pause.